we are looking at what Paul wrote in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 1, verse 12. Now I want you to know that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. What does Paul mean when he says this? And what does it mean for us? Paul is writing while imprisoned in Rome. He was arrested as a result of preaching the gospel, and he appealed to Caesar to hear his case. He is under house arrest, awaiting trial. Though he had freedom to entertain guests and carry on his preaching and teaching, he will have had a constant guard. One commentator explains, according to Roman custom, he was bound by the hand to the soldier who guarded him and was never left alone day or night. The Philippians were concerned about Paul's imprisonment. They saw it as a hindrance to his ministry. But part of the reason why Paul is writing to them is so that they can better understand what God is achieving through this supposed hindrance. He prays for knowledge and depth of insight so that they will be able to discern what is best. Paul is wanting them to gain a proper perspective on his imprisonment. His prison has purpose. His chains, rather than hindering the gospel, are advancing the good news of Jesus Christ. The Greek word that Paul uses here for the advance of the gospel is prokopen. This is made from the words pro, meaning in front of, and kopto, meaning cut or chop down. It literally means advancement by chopping down whatever impedes progress. Picture someone chopping through briars and thick underbush in order to advance forwards and blaze a new trail. Paul's chains, rather than preventing the gospel's progress, are actually serving to cut through obstacles so that the good news about Jesus may spread to those who otherwise would not have heard. Paul's priority is the gospel, to preach Christ crucified and him raised from the dead. Nothing else matters. Though detained and restrained, Paul is not lethargically languishing in prison. He is active and alert, carving out a bespoke ministry despite his chains, or rather, because of his chains. Now this raises a question. If Paul's chains, troubles, hindrances only served to advance the gospel, what about our chains, our restrictions? We can be tempted to moan, groan and grumble about the trials and hardships that we undergo. But what if we were to adopt the same attitude and outlook that Paul displayed, one of joy and purpose? What if we were to ask the question, how are my chains serving to advance the gospel? What if we were to pray, Father, use my chains to advance your gospel? Perhaps by viewing our chains through this lens, we will discover an excitement about what God is doing. So, where and how do Paul's chains advance the gospel? Well, firstly, The gospel has advanced throughout the palace. Paul writes in verse 13, "It has become clear throughout the whole palace guard that I am in chains for Christ." Paul is referring to an elite unit of the Imperial Roman army called the Praetorian Guard. Its members served as personal bodyguards and as an intelligence service for the Roman emperors. So the whole of Nero's top security detail knew why Paul was there, because of Christ Jesus. And with Paul chained constantly to one guard after another, they will have heard his words and seen the authenticity of his life. They wouldn't have been able to escape his witness. God had got them right where he wanted them. You can imagine how the conversations would go. A new guard comes on duty and is chained up to Paul. "So, Paul, what are you in here for?" "Well, for telling others about Jesus Christ." "Who is Jesus Christ?" "I'm so glad you asked. How long does your shift last?" Paul is held captive, but the gospel is running rampant through the whole palace guard. No doubt, as soldiers came to know and accept Christ for themselves, Paul then began to disciple them, all under Nero's nose and paid out of Rome's pocket. Paul never regarded himself as a prisoner of Nero or of Rome, but a prisoner of Christ. Jesus was in charge. Paul was right where Jesus wanted him, in chains that offered him opportunity to minister life. And not only to the guards, but Paul says in verse 13, to everyone else, servants and staff in the palace. In Philippians chapter 4 verse 22, Paul references fellow believers in Caesar's household. The gospel of Jesus Christ was a growing light in the dark heart of Rome. Even under a tyrannical and debauched emperor such as Nero, the gospel was being advanced. Even in the darkest, most desperate of situations, the good news of Jesus advances and shines forth. Paul also tells us that the gospel was advancing because of an increased confidence amongst the believers. He writes in verse 14, "Because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." With Paul chained up, others had to grow up, step up to the mark, stand up and speak up for Christ, and buck up their ideas. This was no time to give up. Facing their fears, they overcame the obstacles and objections with increased courage and confidence. Perhaps they said, if Paul can witness in prison, surely I can witness wherever God has placed me. Each and every disciple of Jesus is to share the good news about him wherever we find ourselves. And Paul was glad that others were preaching Christ, whatever their motives or reasons. Some were doing it out of goodwill and love. Others out of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they could stir up trouble for Paul while he was in chains. What mattered to Paul was not so much the motives of sharing the gospel, not even the consequences for him personally, but the fact that the gospel was being shared and advanced. He writes in verse 18, "But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice." Extraordinary. You may find yourself in less than perfect conditions. You may feel trapped, restricted, and hindered. Yet the Lord calls you to look to Him, to His plans and purposes within and through you. See your chains and pains as opportunity for gains. He is advancing His kingdom. We don't need everything to be easy in order to be fruitful. We may feel stuck in the if onlys. If only I didn't have problems. If only my life were easier. But Paul demonstrates a different mindset. God brings triumph from terrors and tragedies. God turns obstacles into opportunities. God turns an insurmountable stumbling block into a divinely appointed springboard. Give your chains to Christ and see what He does with them to advance His good news. Amen.